Story 1. Paul Augustus Howell was born on June 25, 1965, in Jamaica, an island nation in the Caribbean Sea known for its warm weather and beautiful beaches. He was the son of Jamaican parents, and his family was not wealthy. They lived a simple, ordinary life in their home country. When Howell was still a young boy, his family made the important decision to leave Jamaica and move to the United States. They hoped to find better jobs and more opportunities for their children. The family settled in Florida, a state in the southeastern United States with a warm climate similar to the one they had left behind in Jamaica. Howell spent his childhood and teenage years in Florida. He attended public schools like other children his age, where he learned to read, write, and do basic mathematics. He completed his high school education, and during his school years, he did not display any unusual or violent behavior. Those who knew him considered him a normal student. After graduating from high school, Howell decided to join the United States Armed Forces. He served in the military for a period of time and carried out his duties without any major problems. When his service ended, he received an honorable discharge, meaning he left the military in good standing rather than being forced out because of bad behavior or disciplinary issues. His military record remained clean. After leaving the military, Howell returned to civilian life and moved to Fort Lauderdale, a busy city on Florida's southern coast. There, he began looking for work and tried to build a life for himself. Over time, however, Howell became involved in drug trafficking, which involved buying and selling illegal drugs. He developed connections with other people in the drug trade and began making money from these activities. Eventually, he became part of a group that obtained drugs in Fort Lauderdale and transported them to other parts of Florida for sale. One of the main destinations was the town of Marianna, located in northern Florida, many miles from Fort Lauderdale. Howell's brother, Patrick, was also involved in the same drug operation. The two brothers worked together in the illegal business and built connections with other people in both Fort Lauderdale and Marianna. One of those associates was a woman named Tammy Bailey, who lived in Marianna. She was part of the drug ring and helped sell drugs in that area. As Howell became more involved in criminal activity, he also surrounded himself with friends and acquaintances from the drug trade. Among these people, he developed a reputation for being involved in dangerous activities. Some knew that he had made pipe bombs in the past. Pipe bombs are explosive devices capable of causing serious injury or death, and Howell had experience building them. This was highly unusual behavior and served as a warning sign that he was willing to use violence. Despite his criminal activities, Howell maintained personal relationships. He had a wife and a family, and to some people, he appeared to be a devoted family man. He also behaved well while being held in jail before his trial. At the same time, however, his involvement with drugs and explosives continued to grow, drawing him deeper into illegal activities. Up to this point, Howell had no significant history of criminal arrests or convictions. His record did not include any major crimes. Even so, his decision to enter the drug trade placed him on an increasingly dangerous path. He was making money by selling illegal drugs, working alongside others involved in criminal activity, and building pipe bombs. Together, these actions showed that he was moving toward more serious criminal behavior. By this stage of his life, Howell's story was a combination of ordinary experiences and increasingly dangerous choices. He had grown up in a modest family, immigrated to a new country, and served honorably in the military. But he later chose to enter the world of drugs and violence, becoming part of a drug ring that operated between Fort Lauderdale and Marianna. He had close ties to people such as his brother Patrick and Tammy Bailey, and he also possessed the knowledge and ability to make explosives. All of these factors set the stage for what would come next. However, at this point in his life, he had not yet committed the crime that would ultimately lead to his execution. That crime was still in the future. but the path toward it had already been set in motion. By this time, Howell had become deeply involved in drug trafficking alongside his brother, Patrick, and a woman named Tammy Bailey. Bailey lived in Marianna, Florida, and she knew information that could be dangerous for the two brothers. Specifically, she had knowledge that could connect Howell and Patrick to an earlier murder. This posed a serious threat to Howell. If Bailey ever spoke to the police, she could provide information that might lead to their arrest for that previous killing. Howell decided that Bailey had to be eliminated as a witness, and he began planning her murder. The plan started with Howell building a bomb in his home in Fort Lauderdale. Because he already had experience making pipe bombs, he knew how to construct one. The explosive device was designed to detonate when someone opened the container holding it. Howell intended for the bomb to be delivered directly to Bailey's home in Marianna, so he concealed it inside a microwave oven. After placing the bomb inside, he closed the microwave door and set the device to explode when the door was opened. He then wrapped the entire microwave in gift paper, so it looked like an ordinary present. His plan was to trick Bailey into opening the gift and triggering the explosion. To deliver the bomb, Howell needed someone else to transport it, so it could not be traced directly back to him. He recruited a man named Lester Watson, an acquaintance of his, and paid him $200 to drive the gift-wrapped microwave from Fort Lauderdale to Marianna. Watson agreed to make the trip, but Howell never told him what was actually inside the package. Watson had seen Howell wrapping it and knew that Howell had made pipe bombs before. Even so, Watson later said he believed the microwave contained drugs rather than a bomb. He thought he was simply transporting drugs for Howell to sell in Marianna, so he accepted both the money and the package without realizing the danger. To make the trip possible, Howell rented a car for Watson to use. The rental was made in Howell's name because Watson did not have a valid driver's license and therefore could not rent a vehicle himself. Howell provided the car, so Watson could make the long drive from Fort Lauderdale to Marianna. Watson was not traveling alone. A man named Curtis Williams accompanied him on the journey. Neither Watson nor Williams knew that the microwave concealed an explosive device. Watson began driving north on Interstate 10, a major highway that runs across the northern part of Florida. Marianna was his destination. As he traveled, he drove faster than the legal speed limit, a decision that would prove to be critical. His speeding caught the attention of a law enforcement officer. On February 1st, 1992, Watson was driving on Interstate 10 through Jefferson County, Florida, which is located near the Florida Panhandle. He was still about an hour away from Marianna when Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Jimmy Fulford spotted the speeding vehicle. Trooper Fulford, who was 35 years old, was on routine patrol that day. After noticing the speeding car, he activated his emergency lights and signaled for Watson to pull over. Watson complied and stopped on the side of the highway. Trooper Fulford approached the vehicle and asked Watson for his driver's license and registration. Because Watson did not have a valid driver's license, he tried to avoid trouble by giving the trooper a false name and a false date of birth. He hoped his real identity would not be discovered. Trooper Fulford took the information Watson provided and radioed his dispatcher to run a records check. The dispatcher checked the registration of the rental car and found that it had been rented in Howell's name. The dispatcher then contacted Howell at his home in Fort Lauderdale and asked whether the rental car had been stolen. Howell replied that he had loaned the car to a man named Watson. However, he also said that he had not known Watson would be traveling so far from Fort Lauderdale. The dispatcher informed Howell that Watson was going to be taken to the Jefferson County Jail because he had provided false information during the traffic stop. At that moment, Howell knew law enforcement officers had stopped the vehicle and were examining it. He also knew that the bomb was hidden inside the microwave in the trunk. Despite this, he never warned the dispatcher or anyone else about the explosive device. Instead, he chose to remain silent. While Trooper Fulford was conducting the traffic stop, two deputies from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department arrived to assist him. They were Deputy Harrell and Deputy Blunt. Watson gave the deputies permission to search the vehicle. When Trooper Fulford and the deputies opened the trunk, they found the gift-wrapped microwave oven. It appeared to be an ordinary present, and none of them knew it contained a bomb. Watson was then placed under arrest for speeding, driving without a valid driver's license, and providing a false name to the trooper. Deputy Blunt transported Watson to the Jefferson County Jail and also took Curtis Williams there. Deputy Harrell left the scene as well and went to the jail, leaving Trooper Fulford alone beside the rental car on the highway. Trooper Fulford stayed behind to complete an inventory of the vehicle's contents. Because Watson had given permission to search the car, the trooper had the authority to continue his inspection. He removed the gift-wrapped microwave from the trunk, unwrapped it, and looked inside. As he opened the microwave door to see what it contained, the bomb detonated instantly. The explosion was massive and extremely powerful. Trooper Fulford was holding the microwave in his hands when it exploded, and the blast caused such severe injuries that he died immediately. He was 35 years old and left behind a wife and 2 children. The force of the explosion was so great that it left a depression in the surface of Interstate 10, and the blast was felt over a wide area. Had the bomb reached its intended destination at Tammy Bailey's apartment, the consequences would have been even more devastating. Bailey lived in a duplex with her baby. In the adjoining unit lived another mother and her 2 children. The bomb was powerful enough to blow out the doors and walls of the building. It would have killed Bailey, her baby, the neighboring mother, her 2 children, and possibly Watson and Williams, who would have been present to deliver the package. The bomb was also intended to kill another woman, Yolanda McAllister, Bailey's friend, who also had knowledge about the earlier murder. Although Howell's intended targets were 2 women, the device was designed in a way that could easily have killed many more innocent people, including young children. At the time of the explosion, Howell was not in Jefferson County. He remained in Fort Lauderdale, many miles away. Even so, he had set the entire chain of events in motion. He built the bomb, hid it inside the microwave, wrapped it as a gift, rented the car, and paid Watson to transport it. Then, after learning from the dispatcher that police had stopped the vehicle, he said nothing about the bomb. His silence allowed the explosion to occur and led directly to the death of Trooper Fulford, who had pulled Watson over for nothing more than a routine traffic violation. The trooper had no idea he was dealing with an explosive device. He was simply carrying out his duties as a highway patrol officer. Patrick Howell also played a role in planning the crime. He helped his brother build the bomb and worked alongside him in creating the explosive device intended to kill Tammy Bailey. Both brothers participated in preparing the weapon. Lester Watson was the person who transported the bomb, but he did not know it was an explosive device. He believed the microwave contained drugs and thought he was acting only as a courier in an illegal drug delivery. He had no intention of killing anyone and played no role in planning the bombing. His only task was to drive the car and deliver the package, unaware that he was carrying a bomb that would ultimately take a life. By this point, the crime had been committed. Trooper Fulford was dead, and the bomb had exploded on Interstate 10 in Jefferson County. Watson and Williams were being held in jail, but they had not yet been charged with the full crime. Although investigators had already spoken with Howell during the dispatcher's phone call, they did not yet know that he was the person who had built the bomb. The investigation was only beginning. Authorities were still trying to determine exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Their immediate focus was the deadly explosion and the death of the trooper, but the full story had not yet come to light. Howell and his brother Patrick had not yet been arrested. That would happen later, as investigators gradually pieced together the evidence. The explosion on Interstate 10 was so powerful that it immediately drew the attention of other law enforcement officers and emergency responders, who arrived at the scene shortly after the blast. They found Trooper Jimmy Fulford dead. His body had suffered massive trauma from the explosion. The microwave oven had been completely destroyed, the gift wrapping was shredded, and debris was scattered across the highway. It quickly became clear to the officers that a bomb had exploded. They knew this was not an accident, and a full investigation began. The first step was to question the people who were already in custody. Lester Watson and Curtis Williams were still being held at the Jefferson County Jail. During his interview, Watson described his trip from Fort Lauderdale and explained that Howell had paid him to deliver a package. He said he believed the package contained drugs and had no idea it was actually a bomb. Watson also told investigators about Howell's background, including the fact that Howell had made pipe bombs in the past. This information proved to be a major breakthrough. For the first time, investigators had a primary suspect, Paul Augustus Howell. They also knew where to find him, in Fort Lauderdale. Investigators also confirmed that the rental car had been rented in Howell's name. Records from the rental company verified that Howell was the person who rented the vehicle, and the dispatcher's call log showed that he had been contacted while the traffic stop was taking place. The evidence was beginning to point directly at him. He had rented the car, he had been informed that it had been stopped by law enforcement, he had failed to warn anyone about the bomb inside, and Watson had identified him as the person who gave him the package. These pieces of evidence were collected during the hours and days following the explosion. Based on this evidence, law enforcement officers obtained an arrest warrant for Howell. They traveled to Fort Lauderdale, arrested him, and charged him with the murder of Trooper Fulford. He was also charged with making, possessing, placing, and discharging a destructive device or bomb. His brother, Patrick Howell, was arrested as well and charged for helping to build the bomb. Investigators believed Patrick had assisted in constructing the explosive device, leaving both brothers facing serious criminal charges. As the investigation continued, the case against Howell grew stronger. Detectives interviewed numerous witnesses and collected physical evidence from the explosion site. They carefully examined the remains of the microwave oven and the bomb, while explosives experts analyzed the device and testified about both its construction and its destructive power. Investigators also expanded their focus to Howell's drug trafficking activities. They uncovered evidence that he was part of a large drug ring operating between Fort Lauderdale and Marianna. What had begun as an investigation into Trooper Fulford's death soon developed into a much broader criminal investigation. State and federal authorities worked together, eventually dismantling the entire drug operation. In total, 28 people were indicted on charges related to the drug ring and the bombing. Although Howell was not the only person involved in the criminal organization, investigators concluded that he bore the greatest responsibility for Trooper Fulford's death. Howell's trial was held in Escambia County, Florida. The case was moved there because it had received extensive publicity in Jefferson County, and the court wanted a jury that had not been influenced by local news coverage. The trial began on October 12, 1994. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing that Howell built the bomb, concealed it inside the microwave oven, wrapped it as a gift, and paid Watson to deliver it. They also demonstrated that Howell knew the vehicle had been stopped by police, yet chose not to warn anyone about the bomb inside. The prosecution argued that Howell intended to kill Tammy Bailey and Yolanda McAllister, but that he also knew, or should have known, that law enforcement officers might inspect the package. The jury heard testimony from Lester Watson, who stated that he believed he was transporting drugs and had no knowledge that the package contained a bomb. They also heard from explosives experts, who explained how the device had been built and how it functioned, as well as from the dispatcher who had spoken with Howell on the day of the explosion. Howell's defense attorney argued that Howell had not built the bomb. The defense questioned Watson's credibility by pointing to his criminal record. They also suggested that Trooper Fulford should not have opened the wrapped package, arguing that he may have violated department policy by inspecting a sealed container. However, the defense did not emphasize this argument because counsel believed blaming the trooper could anger the jury. Instead, they focused on the claim that Howell never intended to kill a police officer and that Bailey, not Fulford, had been the intended target. Despite these arguments, the evidence against Howell was overwhelming. On October 18, 1994, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. They also found him guilty of making and possessing a destructive device. The case then moved into the penalty phase, during which the jury had to decide whether Howell should receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. The prosecution presented several aggravating factors, which are circumstances that support imposing the death penalty. They argued that Howell knowingly created a great risk of death to many people. The bomb, they pointed out, could have killed Bailey, her baby, the neighboring family, Watson, and Williams. They also argued that the murder occurred while Howell was making and placing a bomb, that it was committed to avoid arrest by eliminating a witness, that the victim was a law enforcement officer performing his official duties, and that the murder was cold, calculated, and premeditated. The defense presented mitigating factors, which are reasons why the death penalty should not be imposed. They argued that Howell had no significant criminal history before this case, that he was under emotional disturbance at the time of the crime, that he had served honorably in the military, that he behaved well while in jail, and that he was a good family man. After considering all of the evidence, the jury recommended the death penalty by a vote of 10-2. Although the recommendation was not unanimous, it was sufficient under Florida law. The trial judge then made the final sentencing decision. On January 10, 1995, Howell was sentenced to death for the murder of Trooper Fulford. He also received a death sentence for making and placing the destructive device. In a detailed sentencing order, the judge explained that the aggravating factors greatly outweighed the mitigating factors. He concluded that Howell was the person most responsible for the crime and noted that Howell's co-defendants had received less severe sentences. Lester Watson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Patrick Howell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence. According to the judge, Howell was far more culpable because he had planned the murder and built the bomb. After sentencing, Howell began the lengthy appeals process that is common in death penalty cases. His first appeal was filed with the Florida Supreme Court. He argued that his trial attorney had been ineffective and that several of the aggravating factors should not have been applied. After reviewing the case, the Florida Supreme Court rejected these arguments and affirmed both his conviction and death sentence on February 12, 1998. Howell then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, but on June 26, 1998, that court declined to hear his case. As a result, his conviction became final on that date. Howell next filed a motion for post-conviction relief in state court, a different type of legal challenge. He again argued that his trial attorney had made serious mistakes. Specifically, he claimed his lawyer should have introduced evidence that Trooper Fulford violated department policy by opening the microwave. Howell argued that this would have shown the trooper's own actions contributed to his death. The state court held an evidentiary hearing on the claim. Howell's trial attorney, Frank Sheffield, testified that he deliberately chose not to present that argument because he believed blaming the trooper would anger the jury and ultimately damage Howell's defense. The state court agreed with Sheffield's reasoning and denied Howell's motion on January 2, 2003. Howell appealed once more to the Florida Supreme Court, which affirmed the denial on May 6, 2004. Howell also filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. He argued that his state post-conviction attorney had failed to file the petition within the required time and asked the court to allow his case to proceed despite the delay. The federal district court dismissed the petition on December 1, 2004, because it had been filed too late. Howell appealed that decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. On July 6, 2005, the court affirmed the dismissal, ruling that attorney negligence was not a valid reason for filing late and that Howell himself had not acted diligently in pursuing his claims. He then appealed once again to the United States Supreme Court, which denied his petition on January 9, 2006. By this stage, Howell had exhausted all of his ordinary appeals. Even so, he continued filing additional motions and legal requests. One of his final challenges concerned Florida's lethal injection protocol. The state had changed the drugs used in executions because the previous drug was no longer available. Florida adopted a new 3-drug combination. The first drug, midazolam hydrochloride, was intended to sedate the prisoner. The second drug caused paralysis, and the third stopped the heart. Howell argued that midazolam might not work effectively and might fail to fully sedate him before the remaining drugs were administered. His attorneys filed appeals seeking to stop the execution on those grounds. Both the Florida Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court rejected those arguments and refused to halt the execution. On February 26, 2014, Paul Augustus Howell was executed at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. He was 48 years old. The execution took place 1 year after his original scheduled execution date because he had received a reprieve the previous year. By then, however, all of his legal challenges had been exhausted. Before the execution, Howell chose a peanut butter and jelly sandwich as his final meal and met with a spiritual advisor. As the execution began, he opened his eyes wide, lifted his head, and began to pray. When asked whether he had any final words, Howell apologized to Trooper Fulford's family. He then delivered a 2-minute statement in which he described the events of the crime and placed some of the blame on Lester Watson for allowing the bomb to explode. Howell was pronounced dead at 6:32 p.m. The execution was carried out using Florida's new 3-drug protocol and was the 5th execution in the state to use that combination. Trooper Fulford's family chose not to attend the execution. They had already endured more than 20 years of appeals and court hearings, each one forcing them to relive his death. Fulford's brother later said that true closure would never come because the only real closure would be seeing his brother walk through the front door again, something that could never happen. Even so, the family found some comfort in knowing that Trooper Fulford's actions had prevented an even greater tragedy. Had the bomb reached Tammy Bailey's apartment, many more innocent people, including children, would likely have been killed. In that sense, Fulford's sacrifice was not in vain. His actions prevented a far larger loss of life. After Howell's execution, the case officially came to an end. Howell had been held accountable for his crimes. Trooper Jimmy Fulford continued to be remembered as an outstanding law enforcement officer and a devoted family man. He served as a deacon at his church, sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, and enjoyed fishing and hunting. He was known as a kind neighbor and had fulfilled his lifelong dream of becoming a Florida Highway Patrol trooper. His death was a tremendous loss to his family, his community, and the law enforcement profession. The investigation that followed his murder led to the dismantling of a major drug ring, resulting in the arrests and convictions of many people. But none of those outcomes could bring Trooper Fulford back. He died while faithfully performing his duty on Interstate 10 in Jefferson County, and the man responsible for setting those events in motion was executed 22 years later. Story 2. Ray Jasper III was born on August 25, 1980, in the Netherlands. His father served in the United States Air Force, which meant the family moved frequently because of his military career and rarely stayed in one place for very long. During Ray's childhood, the family eventually moved to California, where he spent part of his early years. Later, when he was about 15 years old, they relocated to San Antonio, Texas. It was a major change, and Ray had to adjust to a new city, a new school, and new people. Throughout his childhood, Ray's parents remained married, providing a stable home in that sense. His father had a steady military career that gave the family a reliable income and benefits. Although they were not wealthy, they lived comfortably and did not grow up in poverty. When Ray was in school, however, he struggled to follow the rules. He was caught with marijuana on school property, which violated both the law and school policy. As a result, he was transferred to an alternative campus, a special school designed for students with behavioral or disciplinary problems. Even there, Ray continued to get into trouble and was eventually expelled. He never completed much of his high school education, finishing only the 8th grade. As a result, he entered adulthood with very little formal education. His behavioral problems were not limited to school. Ray began getting into trouble with the law at a young age. At 15, he stole a bicycle. Although it was a relatively minor crime, it marked the beginning of a pattern that would become increasingly serious over the following years. On March 20th, 1997, when Ray was 16 years old, he was caught driving a car without a driver's license. A police officer spotted him traveling 62 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone and attempted to pull him over. Instead of stopping, Ray sped away, leading the officer on a high-speed chase that reached speeds of more than 90 miles per hour. The pursuit finally ended when Ray crashed the car onto a set of railroad tracks. The incident showed that he was willing to take significant risks and break the law in dangerous ways. Around this time, Ray was in a relationship with a young woman named Christina Breton. She began living with Ray and his parents when she was about 15 years old. The couple stayed together for a long time and had a daughter together. They talked about getting married someday, and Ray wanted to move out of his parents' home and rent an apartment where he, Christina, and their daughter could live together. Becoming independent and providing for his small family was one of his main goals. Ray also had a strong interest in music. He was a member of a rap group and even created his own record label because he wanted to pursue music professionally. Along with his friends, he wrote and performed rap songs, hoping to record them in a professional environment. To do that, they needed access to a recording studio, a place equipped with soundboards, computers, microphones, and other specialized equipment used to produce high-quality recordings. Ray did not own a studio himself and could not afford to buy such expensive equipment. Instead, he found a recording studio in San Antonio that met his needs. It was owned and operated by David Alejandro, who was also a musician and the lead singer of a Christian music group. In addition to performing, David ran the recording studio as a business, charging musicians to use his studio and equipment. He had a reputation for being kind and helpful, giving many new artists the opportunity to record their music. Ray Jasper and his friends became regular customers, frequently visiting the studio to record their rap songs. David often sat at the soundboard, helping them mix their tracks and improve the quality of their recordings. As November 1998 drew to a close, Ray had several things weighing on his mind. He wanted money so he could move out of his parents' house and get an apartment with Christina and their daughter. At the same time, he was dealing with legal trouble. On November 23, 1998, an off-duty police officer who worked as a robbery detective spotted Ray in a neighborhood and believed he might be acting as a lookout for a burglary. The detective approached him, identified himself as a police officer, and attempted to make contact. Rather than cooperate, Ray attacked him, charging at the officer and striking him repeatedly. The detective felt so threatened that he threw his handgun away in an effort to gain control of the situation. Ray was arrested and charged with assaulting a public servant. The following day, he was released from jail after posting a $10,000 bond, allowing him to remain free while awaiting his court date. Despite being out on bond for assaulting a police officer, Ray continued living much as he had before. He kept recording music at David Alejandro's studio and continued discussing his future plans with Christina. He told her he wanted to move out and that he needed money to make it happen. As he thought about ways to get that money, he also thought about the recording equipment inside David's studio. Having seen it many times, he knew how valuable it was and believed it could be sold for a significant amount of money. By this point, Ray's past showed a pattern of increasingly serious behavior. It had begun with stealing a bicycle at age 15, followed by being caught with marijuana at school, then leading police on a dangerous high-speed chase, and finally physically attacking a police officer. Each incident was more serious than the last. Ray had shown that he was willing to break the law to get what he wanted, and was also willing to use violence. He was now 18 years old, with a girlfriend, a daughter, dreams of building a career in music, and a growing criminal record. He was out on bond for a violent crime, still recording his rap music at David's studio, and still thinking about money and how to get it. Ray Jasper had been to David Alejandro's recording studio many times and knew it well. He knew where the equipment was kept and understood how valuable it was. He estimated that the computers, soundboards, and microphones could be sold for between $10,000 and $30,000. To Ray, that was enough money to solve his immediate problems. He believed it would allow him to move out of his parents' house and get the apartment he wanted. However, Ray also recognized a major problem. David knew him personally. He had seen Ray many times, knew his face, and knew his name. If the equipment were stolen, David would be able to identify him to the police. Ray believed that would lead to his arrest and send him back to jail. In Ray's mind, the only way to prevent that was to make sure David could never speak to the police. He decided that David had to die so there would be no witness. This was not a decision Ray made on impulse. He thought about it for several days. Around 7 to 10 days before the planned crime, he made up his mind and began organizing everything carefully. Knowing he could not carry all the heavy equipment by himself, he recruited 2 friends to help him. The first was Stephen J. Russell, and the second was Douglas Deshaun Williams. Both agreed to take part. Ray explained the plan to them. They would go to the studio, record music as they normally did, then attack David, steal the equipment, and leave. Ray also told his girlfriend, Christina Breton, about his plan several days before the crime. He said he intended to steal David's recording equipment, and he also told her that he was going to kill David. Christina heard what Ray said, but she did not report him to the police. On November 21st, 1998, Ray went to a sporting goods store called Academy, where he bought several large bags. They were big enough to carry heavy items such as computers and soundboards. After bringing the bags home, he also took a black bedsheet from his own bed. He planned to use it to cover David's body after the attack because he did not want to have to look at it. Ray then scheduled a recording session with David for Sunday morning, November 29, 1998. David agreed to the appointment, unaware that anything was wrong. He believed he would simply be helping Ray and his friends record their music, just as he had done many times before. On the morning of November 29th, Ray met with his 2 accomplices. They had 2 vans and drove both vehicles to David's recording studio in San Antonio. When they arrived, they went inside. Ray and Stephen Russell were each carrying kitchen knives they had taken from Ray's kitchen. The knives were concealed on their bodies so David would not see them. Douglas Williams was not armed with a knife, but he was part of the plan. For about 2 hours, the 3 men spent time in the studio with David as if nothing was unusual. David sat at the soundboard, mixing their music and helping improve their rap recordings. As always, he was friendly and helpful. He treated them the way he always had, and had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. The recording session proceeded normally for those 2 hours. Then Ray decided it was time to carry out the plan. He walked up behind David while David was seated at the soundboard, focused on the music and unaware that Ray was standing behind him. Ray grabbed David by the hair, pulled his head back, and drew a kitchen knife across his throat, cutting it from ear to ear. The wound did not kill David immediately. He jumped up from his chair, clutching his throat as blood poured from the deep cut. He made gurgling sounds because he could no longer speak properly, but he was still alive and trying to survive. Seeing a nearby 2x4 piece of wood, David grabbed it and began swinging it at Ray in an attempt to defend himself. Ray wrestled the board away from David and struck him on the head with it. He then called for his accomplices to help. Stephen Russell rushed into the room carrying his own knife. While Ray held David in place, Russell repeatedly stabbed him in the chest. The attack was relentless. David suffered a total of 25 stab wounds to his chest, abdomen, back, and neck. One of the knives was left embedded in the back of his neck. After sustaining those injuries, David collapsed and died. Once David was dead, Ray took the black bedsheet he had brought with him and covered David's body. He did this because he did not want to look at the dead man's face. He then instructed his accomplices to begin loading the recording equipment. Working quickly, they carried computers, soundboards, and other equipment out of the studio and into the 2 vans, making several trips back and forth until they had taken as much as they could carry. While they were loading the vans, something unexpected happened. An off-duty police officer arrived at the studio after noticing something suspicious and came to investigate. As soon as Ray saw the officer, he ran away on foot without waiting. He abandoned the vans and his accomplices and fled the scene as quickly as he could. Although the officer was unable to catch him at that moment, Ray's escape would not last long. 3 days later, on December 2nd, 1998, police officers located Ray outside his home and arrested him for the murder of David Alejandro. He was taken to the police station, where he confessed. Ray admitted that he had planned the crime, recruited the 2 accomplices, and personally cut David's throat. He gave investigators a detailed account of what had happened. After Ray confessed, police also questioned the 2 accomplices. Stephen Russell and Douglas Williams were arrested and charged for their roles in the crime. They had participated in the attack on David and had helped load the stolen equipment into the vans. As a result, they were also facing serious criminal charges. After Ray Jasper confessed to police on December 2nd, 1998, the case moved forward quickly. His confession was detailed and matched the physical evidence investigators had already gathered from the crime scene. Police recovered fingerprints from the recording studio, the knives used in the attack, the black bedsheet Ray had brought from his own bed, and the vans used to transport the stolen equipment. Together, this evidence pointed directly to Ray and his 2 accomplices. Investigators also interviewed Ray's girlfriend, Christina Breton. She told police that several days before the murder, Ray had described his plan to her. According to Christina, Ray said he intended to steal David Alejandro's recording equipment and kill him so there would be no witness. Her testimony became an important part of the prosecution's case because it showed that the crime had been planned in advance and that Ray had discussed it with someone beforehand. On June 1st, 1999, a grand jury in Behar County formally indicted Ray Jasper on a charge of capital murder. A grand jury is a group of citizens who determine whether there is enough evidence for a criminal case to proceed to trial. In Ray's case, they concluded that there was. The trial began in January 2000 in the 187th District Court of Behar County, with Judge Raymond Angelini presiding. A jury was selected, and the prosecution presented its evidence against Ray. Jurors were shown the knives, the black bedsheet, and the stolen recording equipment. They also heard Ray's confession to police. Witnesses testified throughout the trial, including Christina Breton, who repeated what Ray had told her about his plan. The medical examiner also testified, explaining that David had suffered 25 stab wounds and that those injuries were the cause of his death. Ray's defense attorneys argued that he should not be found guilty of murder based on the medical examiner's findings. The examiner testified that the throat wound Ray admitted inflicting was not the injury that caused David's death. Instead, the fatal injuries were the 25 stab wounds inflicted by Stephen Russell. Under Texas law, however, a person can still be convicted of capital murder, even if they did not deliver the fatal wound. This legal principle, known as the law of parties, holds that anyone who knowingly participates in a murder can be held equally responsible. Prosecutors argued that Ray planned the crime, recruited the accomplices, and initiated the attack, making him responsible for David's death. Against the advice of his attorneys, Ray chose to testify in his own defense. While on the witness stand, he made a statement that drew significant attention. Looking directly at David's family members seated in the courtroom, he said, "I didn't kill your son. He was one of the nicest guys I ever met, but I did not kill him." He maintained that he had only admitted to cutting David's throat, not to delivering the stab wounds that caused his death. Ray also stated that while he was testifying, he had thoughts of taking the court bailiff's gun. The comment was unusual and damaging to his defense. The jury rejected Ray's argument. After deliberating for only 15 minutes, they found him guilty of capital murder. The case then moved into the punishment phase, during which the jury had to decide whether Ray should receive a life sentence or the death penalty. Prosecutors presented evidence of his criminal history and prior misconduct, including the bicycle theft he committed at age 15, his marijuana possession at school, the high-speed police chase, and the violent assault on an off-duty police officer just days before David's murder. They argued that Ray's conduct showed a pattern of escalating violence and that he would remain a danger to society if allowed to live. The defense, in contrast, presented mitigating evidence, including Ray's young age and his family background, in an effort to persuade the jury to spare his life. As required under Texas law in death penalty cases, the jury answered a series of special questions. They concluded that Ray would likely continue to pose a danger to society, and that there were not enough mitigating circumstances to justify a life sentence. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury decided that Ray should be sentenced to death. On January 20th, 2000, Judge Raymond Angelini formally imposed the death sentence. Ray's 2 accomplices faced separate legal proceedings. Stephen J. Russell accepted a plea agreement offered by prosecutors. By pleading guilty, he received a life sentence and avoided the possibility of a death sentence following a trial. Douglas Deshaun Williams chose to go to trial instead. A jury found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to life in prison. As a result, both accomplices avoided the death penalty. Ray did not accept his conviction and sentence without a fight. He began a lengthy appeals process. His case was automatically reviewed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest court for criminal cases. In November 2001, that court upheld both his conviction and his death sentence, rejecting all of his arguments. Ray later filed a state habeas corpus petition, another legal method used to challenge a conviction, but the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied that petition in August 2008. Ray then turned to the federal court system. He filed a petition for habeas corpus relief in the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas, but the district court denied his petition in January 2011. He appealed that ruling to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which affirmed the lower court's decision in April 2012. Ray then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case. In December 2012, the Supreme Court declined to hear it, leaving him with no remaining appeals. One of the claims Ray raised during the appeals process was that a black prospective juror had been excluded because of race, violating his constitutional rights. The courts reviewed that claim and rejected it. They concluded that the prosecutor had provided race-neutral reasons for removing the juror, including the juror's doubts about the death penalty and inconsistent answers during questioning. The courts determined that race had not been the reason for the strike. On October 17, 2013, the District Court of Behar County signed an order setting Ray Jasper's execution for March 19, 2014. As the execution date approached, his attorneys made one final attempt to stop it by asking the United States Supreme Court to intervene. About 30 minutes before the scheduled execution, the Supreme Court denied the request. At that point, Ray had exhausted every available legal option. On March 19, 2014, Ray Jasper was taken to the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas, where he was executed by lethal injection using a single dose of pentobarbital. Before the execution began, he was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Speaking quietly, he told his family to take care of one another and remain strong and faithful to God. He thanked those who had supported him, told his daughter that he loved her, and encouraged her to stay strong, remain positive, and have a good life. He ended with a prayer, asking the Lord God Almighty in heaven to receive his spirit, and then said he was ready. The execution began. His breathing became heavy, and he started to snore. Each breath gradually became quieter until all movement stopped. Ray Jasper was pronounced dead at 6:31 p.m. He was 33 years old. David Alejandro's family chose not to attend the execution. After Ray's death, David's brother, Eddie Alejandro Jr., released a statement saying that justice had been served. He said Ray Jasper had caused tremendous pain to their family and described David's death as a loss that had broken his heart. Another brother, Stephen Alejandro, had previously written about his opposition to the death penalty. Although he did not support Ray's execution, he also did not campaign to stop it. He explained that he rarely thought about Ray Jasper. Instead, he focused on remembering his brother David and the happy memories they had shared. With the execution completed, the case finally came to an end. Ray Jasper was dead, and David Alejandro remained dead. Ray's two accomplices, Stephen Russell and Douglas Williams, continued serving life sentences in prison, where they remain today. The stolen recording equipment was recovered and returned, but that could never undo the loss. David Alejandro had been a kind man who helped young musicians by giving them opportunities to record their music. Among those he helped was Ray Jasper. In return, David was killed by someone he had trusted and supported. Ray Jasper's execution brought the legal case to a close, but for David Alejandro's family, the loss continues to be felt. Story 3. Robert Laverne Henry was born on May 1, 1958, in Boynton Beach, Florida, a city in Palm Beach County on the state's southeastern coast. He was a black man who grew up there during the 1960s and 1970s. Robert's family remained an important part of his life. He had a mother, a sister, an aunt, and a niece, and they stayed close over the years. They visited him regularly and kept in touch throughout his adult life. His father is not mentioned in any public records, so it is unclear whether he was involved during Robert's childhood. What is known is that his mother and sister continued to play important roles in his life. As a child, Robert attended local schools in Boynton Beach and the surrounding area. There are no detailed public records about his grades or his behavior in school. He grew up like many other boys in his neighborhood, spending time with friends and going about his daily life. There is no information suggesting that he got into serious trouble with the law during his childhood or teenage years. After finishing school, Robert decided to join the United States Marine Corps. He became a Marine, serving in a branch of the military that demands physical fitness and discipline. During his service, he learned valuable skills, followed orders, and lived within the structured environment of the military. At some point, he received an honorable discharge and returned to Florida. Up to that time, he had no criminal record and had never been convicted of any serious crime before the events that would later unfold. Once his military service ended, Robert needed to find work. Over the years, he held different jobs, including working as a custodian, cleaning and maintaining buildings. He also worked as a maintenance man, fixing equipment and keeping workplaces clean and orderly. He was an ordinary working man who earned a living through steady employment rather than a high-profile career. By 1987, Robert was 29 years old and working at a store called Cloth World on South Federal Highway in Deerfield Beach, Florida. Deerfield Beach is in Broward County, just south of Boynton Beach. Cloth World was a fabric store that sold cloth, sewing supplies, and other materials used for making clothes and crafts. Robert worked there as the maintenance man, keeping the store clean and taking care of small repairs. At the store, Robert worked alongside several other employees, including 53-year-old Phyllis Harris. Phyllis was married to Bert Harris, a social studies teacher and football coach at Deerfield Beach High School. She worked part-time at Cloth World, while also serving as an attendance clerk at Northeast High School in Oakland Park. She and Bert had moved from Iowa to Deerfield Beach in 1985 because they wanted to live in Florida. The couple had 5 children, all of whom were grown and living on their own. Another of Robert's co-workers was Janet Cox Thermidor, who was 35 years old. Janet was an active member of the choir at St. Paul United Methodist Church in Deerfield Beach and was well known among her church friends. She also worked at Cloth World, where she was regarded as a dependable employee who consistently showed up on time and did her job. Robert worked with both women on a regular basis. There is no public information indicating that he had any personal conflicts with either of them before the events that happened later. They simply worked together, showing up for their shifts each day. Robert handled the store's maintenance and cleaning, while Phyllis and Janet carried out their duties as store employees. Although Robert appeared to live a normal working life, he had personal habits that were not healthy. By 1987, he was using crack cocaine, a powerful and highly addictive illegal drug that affects both the mind and the body. He struggled with this addiction, but kept it hidden from his co-workers. He also drank alcohol. His drug use remained a private problem that affected his thinking and behavior, yet he did not seek help for it during that time. Robert was also known for having a strong will. He preferred making his own decisions and did not like being told what to do. He was stubborn and insisted on handling things in his own way. Although his time in the Marines had taught him discipline, he also had an independent personality and resisted being controlled by others. In the months leading up to November 1987, Robert continued with his daily routine. He went to work at Cloth World, completed his cleaning and maintenance duties, and interacted with Phyllis and Janet throughout the day. Their relationship remained that of co-workers, and nothing unusual was reported at the store during that period. Business continued as normal, with customers coming in to buy fabric, sewing supplies, and other materials while the employees carried out their regular responsibilities. Robert lived his life one day at a time. He had a mother and sister who cared about him, steady employment, and a drug addiction that he kept hidden from those around him. He had no criminal history. At 29 years old, he was a former Marine who had served his country and was now working as a custodian and maintenance man in a fabric store. That was his situation as the month of November arrived. On the evening of November 1st, 1987, the Cloth World store closed for the day. The employees finished helping the final customers, locked the doors, and prepared to complete their closing duties. 3 people remained inside the store, Robert Henry, Phyllis Harris, and Janet Thermidor. Phyllis was working on the sales floor, while Janet went to the back office to count the money from the day's cash register receipts. Robert remained on the floor with Phyllis. At that point, Robert had already made a plan. He wanted to steal the store's money. He knew Janet was in the back office counting the cash, and he decided that would be his target. However, he also knew that both women could identify him afterward. Because of this, he decided he would not leave any witnesses behind. He prepared himself to harm them. He either brought a hammer with him or found one inside the store. He also had access to flammable liquid, which was used in the store for cleaning or other purposes. He was prepared to use these items. Robert first approached Phyllis Harris. He did not tell her what he was planning. Instead, he gave her a false explanation. He told her that unknown robbers had broken into the store and forced him to tie her up and blindfold her. He acted as if he was also a victim and claimed that he had no choice because the robbers were threatening him. Phyllis believed what he told her. Because she thought Robert was being forced to help the attackers, she did not resist. Robert then took Phyllis to the men's restroom inside the store. Once they were there, he took a cord from the store's shelves. The cord was used to hold rolls of fabric. He used it to tie Phyllis's body to a urinal in the restroom. He also placed a blindfold over her eyes so she could not see. She was trapped and unable to move. After tying up Phyllis, Robert went to the back office where Janet Thermidor was counting the day's receipts. The money was in front of her when he entered the room. Without warning, Robert raised the hammer and struck Janet on the head. He did not hit her only once. He struck her repeatedly with the hammer, causing severe injuries and leaving her bleeding from multiple wounds on her head. After Janet was on the floor, Robert took the money she had been counting. He collected the store's cash from that day's sales. The total amount he stole was $1,269.26. He now had the money in his possession, and the robbery itself was complete. However, Robert did not leave the store. He walked out of the office, but then returned carrying a flammable liquid. The liquid was something that could catch fire easily, such as a cleaning solvent or another type of accelerant. He poured the liquid over Janet's body. Janet was still conscious. Although she was badly injured, she could still see and hear what was happening. She begged Robert not to do it and asked him to stop. Robert ignored her pleas and set the liquid on fire. The flames caught onto Janet's body, burning her clothing and her skin. After setting Janet on fire, Robert left the office again and returned to the men's restroom where Phyllis Harris was still tied up. Phyllis was blindfolded and could not see him approaching. She was helpless. Robert took the hammer and attacked her. He struck her on the head with the hammer, using force. He then poured the same flammable liquid over her body and set her on fire as well. The flames spread across her body and began spreading into the restroom and the surrounding areas of the store. Robert then left the store. He had taken the money and abandoned both women inside. Phyllis remained tied up and burning in the restroom. Janet was lying on the office floor, also burning. Robert did not call for help or notify anyone about what had happened. He simply left the store and walked away. Inside the store, the fire continued to grow. The flames and smoke spread throughout the building. At around 9:30 p.m., someone noticed the fire or smoke coming from the store and called 911. Firefighters and police officers were sent to the Cloth World location on South Federal Highway in Deerfield Beach. When firefighters entered the burning building, they began searching for anyone who might still be inside. In the men's restroom, they found Phyllis Harris. She was still tied to the urinal where Robert had left her. She had been struck in the head with a hammer and set on fire. When firefighters found her, her body was still burning. She was already dead. The firefighters continued searching the building and found Janet Thermidor in the women's restroom. She had attempted to escape the flames after being attacked in the office. She had moved from the office to the women's restroom and tried to put out the fire on her body. She was lying on the floor of the restroom. Janet was still alive, but she was in extremely serious condition. She had a deep head wound caused by the hammer blows, and burns covered more than 90% of her body. Despite these devastating injuries, she remained conscious and was able to speak. Emergency workers immediately transported Janet to a local hospital. Doctors attempted to save her life. While she was receiving treatment, police officers came to speak with her about what had happened. Janet was lucid and understood her condition. She knew she was severely injured, but she was able to provide officers with information about the attack. Janet told police that Robert Henry had entered the office and struck her in the head with a hammer. She said he took the store's money. She explained that he left the office, returned later, poured liquid over her, and set her on fire while she begged him not to do it. She also told officers that Robert had done the same thing to Phyllis. Janet identified Robert by name as the person responsible for the attack. Her statement was recorded on tape. In that recording, she said, "I don't know why he had to do that to me. He didn't have to do that to me." Janet Thermidor survived for approximately 12 hours after the attack. However, her injuries were too severe. The burns and the head wound proved fatal. She died on the morning of November 2nd, 1987. Phyllis Harris had already died at the scene of the fire. Based on Janet's dying statement, police now knew the identity of the person responsible for the crime. They began searching for Robert Henry so they could question him. When police first contacted Robert, he did not tell them the truth. Instead, he gave them a false story. He claimed that 3 unknown men had robbed the store. He said the men had forced their way inside, tied up the women, and then abducted him. He claimed that he was not responsible for hurting anyone. This story was a lie. Later, Robert changed his account and began making statements that showed he had acted alone. He admitted that he was the person who had carried out the attack. He said he could not understand why he had done it. However, he admitted that he was the one who struck the women with the hammer, set them on fire, and stole the money. With Janet Thermidor's dying statement and Robert Henry's own later confessions, police had strong evidence against him. Based on Janet's identification, officers arrested Robert on the morning of November 3rd, 1987. He was taken into custody shortly before 7 a.m., and at that point, he was formally charged with the crimes. The state of Florida then brought the case before a grand jury. A grand jury is a group of citizens who review evidence to determine whether there is enough information to formally accuse someone of a crime. On November 18, 1987, the grand jury indicted Robert on 4 counts. The first count was first-degree murder for the death of Phyllis Harris. The second count was first-degree murder for the death of Janet Thermidor. The third count was robbery with a deadly weapon. The fourth count was arson with a deadly weapon. These became the official charges against him. The trial began in 1988 in Broward County, Florida. The case was heard in the circuit court, with Judge Mark E. Poland presiding over the proceedings. A jury made up of citizens was selected to hear the evidence and decide the case. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing that Robert had planned the robbery and killed the 2 women to prevent them from identifying him. They introduced Janet Thermidor's dying declaration, which had been recorded on tape. They also presented Robert's own statements, in which he admitted that he had acted alone. Robert's defense team challenged some of the evidence and argued that certain statements should not be admitted because of the way they were obtained. However, the judge ruled that most of Robert's confessions had been given voluntarily and could be used in court. The jury listened to the testimony and reviewed all of the evidence presented during the trial. On September 29, 1988, the jury reached its decision. They found Robert guilty on all 4 counts. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as armed robbery and arson. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved into the penalty phase. This is the stage where the jury decides whether the convicted person should receive the death penalty or life in prison. During this phase, prosecutors presented aggravating factors, which are reasons that make a crime more serious and can support a death sentence. The prosecutors argued that the murders were committed during a robbery and arson. They said Robert killed the women to avoid being arrested and to prevent them from identifying him. They also argued that the murders were committed for financial gain and that they were especially cruel, heinous, and cold-blooded. Robert's defense team presented mitigating factors, which are reasons that could support a lesser sentence. They pointed out that Robert had no previous criminal record and that he had served in the Marine Corps. Robert himself chose not to present additional witnesses or evidence. He formally waived his right to present testimony from his family members or a psychiatrist on his behalf. The judge allowed the waiver after confirming that Robert understood the decision he was making. The jury then made its recommendation regarding the death penalty. On October 6, 1988, they voted on whether Robert should receive a death sentence. For the murder of Phyllis Harris, the jury voted 8-4 in favor of death. For the murder of Janet Thermidor, they voted 9-3 in favor of death. Judge Poland then considered the jury's recommendations along with the aggravating and mitigating factors. On November 9, 1988, he sentenced Robert to death for each of the two murders. He also sentenced him to 2 concurrent life sentences for the armed robbery and arson. Following the trial, Robert began the appeals process. His lawyers filed an appeal with the Florida Supreme Court. In 1991, the court upheld his convictions and death sentences. Robert's lawyers then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In 1992, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the sentence and sent the case back to Florida for reconsideration. Later that same year, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case again and once more upheld the death sentences. Over the following years, Robert's lawyers continued filing appeals. They submitted post-conviction motions, which are requests asking courts to review a case for possible errors after a conviction. They argued that Robert's trial lawyers had failed to properly investigate his background and his drug use. They also argued that his decision to waive mitigation was not made with full understanding. In addition, they requested DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene. These legal challenges moved through both state and federal courts. The trial court denied the motions, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld those decisions in 2006. Robert also filed a petition for habeas corpus, which is a request asking a court to review whether someone is being held unlawfully. A federal district court in southern Florida denied that petition in 2009. The appeals continued, but none of them were successful. The courts repeatedly found that Robert had received a fair trial and that the evidence supported the death sentences. As the years passed, Robert remained on death row at Florida State Prison. He stayed there for many years while his legal appeals continued. Eventually, his execution date was set for March 20, 2014. As that date approached, Robert's lawyers made one final attempt to stop the execution. They filed an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court challenging Florida's method of lethal injection. They argued that the drugs used in the procedure could cause him pain because of his health conditions. On March 20, 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the final appeal, allowing the execution to proceed. On the day of his execution, Robert was given the opportunity to choose a last meal. He selected red beans and rice, pecan pie, ice cream, and orange juice. He ate most of the meal. He also spent time with his family. His mother, sister, aunt, and niece visited him the day before the execution. On the day itself, he met with a member of his legal team. At 6:05 p.m. on March 20, 2014, the execution began at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. Robert was executed by lethal injection, a procedure in which drugs are injected into the body to stop the heart. Witnesses watched the execution through a thick glass window. Robert had prepared a final statement, which he read aloud before his death. In the statement, he apologized for his crimes and expressed sorrow toward the victims' families and his own family. He also spoke against the death penalty. He said that if society does not castrate rapists or cut off the hands of thieves, then society should not kill murderers either. He compared the death penalty to slavery, explaining that slavery was once legal but is now considered wrong. He said he accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior and was willing to give up his life for a better life after death. While Robert was speaking, a family member of one of the victims was sitting in the front row. The man was Sal Cox, the brother of Janet Thermidor. He listened to Robert's statement. When Robert continued speaking against the death penalty, Sal Cox said one word aloud: "Die." Because of the thick glass separating them, Robert could not hear him, but the other witnesses did. The execution continued. Robert blinked and appeared to move his lips. His breathing slowed and eventually stopped. At 6:16 p.m., Robert Laverne Henry was pronounced dead. He was 55 years old. After the execution, Janet Thermidor's family released a statement. Her sister, Deborah Knights, read the statement publicly. She said they would always remember Janet's life, which had been taken too soon by a demon from hell. She explained that although the execution brought closure, they would never forget the brutal way the two lives were taken without remorse. The case was now closed. The person responsible had been caught, tried, convicted, and punished according to the law. The families of Phyllis Harris and Janet Thermidor could finally move beyond the long legal process, even though the loss of their loved ones would always remain with them. Story 4. Jeffrey R. Ferguson was born on January 24, 1955, in the St. Louis, Missouri area. He grew up in a solid middle-class family. His father worked as a photographer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper and retired in 1995, while his mother stayed at home and raised the children. Ferguson did not come from a poor or troubled household. His childhood was normal, and he had the same opportunities as other children in his neighborhood to build a good life. As a young man, Ferguson got married, and he and his wife had 2 daughters together. For several years, he worked different jobs while trying to support his family. To people around him, he appeared to be a regular husband and father. He had friends, socialized, and seemed to be following a clear path toward a stable and successful life. However, beneath that outward appearance, Ferguson was beginning to develop serious personal problems. Ferguson started drinking alcohol heavily, and he also began using drugs. Over time, his substance abuse became worse. He would drink until he passed out, and on many occasions, he woke up in places he did not remember going to. He often had no memory of what he had done while he was intoxicated. This pattern of heavy drinking and blackouts continued for years. During this period, he also became violent toward people close to him. Ferguson lived with a woman named Holly Veland for about 2 years. During their relationship, he assaulted her many times. He hit her and frequently threatened to kill her. The violence was severe enough that he broke bones in her face, and she needed a metal plate inserted to repair the damage. His violent behavior was not only directed at Holly. During a dispute involving her, Ferguson also shot an acquaintance named Mike Thompson in the shoulder. These incidents showed that Ferguson had a serious temper and was willing to use weapons and physical force against other people. Despite these warning signs in his personal life, Ferguson was not charged with these violent acts at that time. He continued drinking and using drugs. Eventually, his marriage fell apart, and his wife divorced him. He left his family behind and was no longer part of his wife's life. His daughters stopped taking his phone calls and did not respond to his letters. By the late 1980s, Ferguson was a man who had lost his family, struggled with addiction, and had a history of violence toward others. He was no longer the person who had once appeared to have a promising future. However, none of these events had yet led to the crime that would change everything. On the evening of February 9th, 1989, Ferguson was at his home with a friend named Melvin Hedrick. During the evening, Ferguson asked Hedrick if he wanted to buy a .32 caliber pistol. Hedrick said he was not interested in purchasing the gun, but he suggested that they take it with them anyway in case they could find someone at a bar who wanted to buy it. Ferguson placed the pistol in his waistband, and the two men drove to Brothers Bar in St. Charles. They remained there for approximately 45 minutes to an hour. While they were at the bar, Hedrick began feeling sick. Ferguson arranged for another friend, Kenneth Owsley, to meet them at a Shell service station on 5th Street near Interstate 70. Between 10:50 and 10:55 that night, Ferguson and Hedrick drove the short distance to the Shell station. Owsley was already there, waiting in Ferguson's brown and white Chevrolet Blazer. Ferguson put the pistol back in his waistband and walked toward the passenger side of the Blazer. Hedrick then left the area and went home. Across the street from the Shell station was a mobile service station where a 17-year-old girl named Kelly Hall worked. Her shift was scheduled to end at 11 p.m. At around that time, her co-worker Tammy Adams arrived to take over the shift. Before leaving, Kelly went outside to check the fuel levels in the station's 4 underground tanks at the front of the property. This was part of her regular closing duties. A few minutes later, a man named Robert Stolz drove into the mobile station. He knew Kelly Hall and had come there to meet a friend. When he arrived, he saw Kelly checking the fuel tanks. He also noticed a brown and white Blazer pull in front of him and stop in the parking lot near Kelly. The vehicle appeared to be exactly like Ferguson's Blazer. When Stolz looked again, he saw Kelly facing a white male who was standing between the open passenger door and the body of the Blazer. The man was standing very close to her. One of his hands was inside his pocket, while his other hand was free. Stolz then saw Kelly get into the back passenger seat of the Blazer. At the same time, Kelly's boyfriend, Tim Pars, was waiting for her in his car parked behind the station. He had come to give her a ride home. He waited for approximately 30 minutes, but Kelly never came outside. Pars went into the station to look for her, but could not find her anywhere. He and Tammy Adams checked the area and discovered that Kelly's purse was still at the station, but Kelly was not at home either. They realized something was wrong and contacted the police. Early the next morning, February 10th, a street maintenance worker for the city of Chesterfield discovered clothing lying 2 to 3 feet off Creve Coeur Mill Road. The items included a red coat, a blue sweater with a mobile insignia, a white shirt, an undershirt, a bra, underwear, and tennis shoes. Inside the coat pocket, investigators found a red scarf and a mobile credit card slip. Written on the back of the slip were handwritten notes about the fuel levels of 2 of the underground tanks. The clothing belonged to Kelly Hall. Also on February 10th, Melvin Hedrick heard 2 news reports about a girl who had been abducted from a St. Charles gas station. The report stated that police were searching for a Blazer similar to Ferguson's vehicle. Hedrick called Ferguson and jokingly asked if he was the person who had abducted the girl. Ferguson became angry and responded, "I wasn't even in St. Charles last night. Don't tell anybody I was in St. Charles last night." Later that evening, Ferguson called Hedrick again and said he thought they were only joking around earlier. That same night, Kenneth Owsley showed 2 rings to his friend Mike Thompson. Owsley asked Thompson if he knew where they could exchange the rings for money or cocaine. Thompson asked him where the rings came from. Owsley replied that he and Ferguson did a job in St. Charles, and that Ferguson had a 3rd ring. The following day, February 11th, Owsley and Thompson went to see a woman named Alicia Medlock. They asked her for advice about exchanging the rings for drugs or finding a pawn shop. Medlock did not help them. On February 12th, Owsley told Thompson that Ferguson knew a woman in Jefferson County who dealt in jewelry, and that Ferguson would take care of getting rid of the rings. Later that same day, Ferguson offered to sell 3 rings to a woman named Brenda Rosener. He drove to her house and showed her the rings. Rosener asked Ferguson if the rings were hot, meaning stolen. Ferguson replied that they were very hot. Rosener refused to buy them, but Ferguson left the rings with her anyway and told her to think about it. By this point, Hedrick had begun to believe that Ferguson was involved in the crime. On Monday morning, February 13th, Hedrick contacted a co-worker named Glenn Young, who was a former FBI agent. Hedrick suggested that the FBI should investigate Ferguson. Later that day, Ferguson called Hedrick and said he planned to leave town because things were getting too hot. After that, Ferguson and Owsley drove to a friend's auto body shop. Ferguson asked if his Blazer could be painted black. He explained that people driving Blazers were being stopped by police because of Kelly Hall's disappearance, and he wanted to avoid being hassled. However, the shop owner was too busy to complete the work that day, so Ferguson and Owsley left without making an appointment. Around this same time, the street maintenance worker who had found Kelly's clothing realized that the items might be important to the investigation. He turned the clothing over to police. The next day, February 14th, Kelly Hall's mother identified the clothing as the clothes her daughter had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Several days later, on February 18th, Ferguson called Hedrick again. He told Hedrick that the FBI had searched his house, but had not found anything. Ferguson urged Hedrick not to tell anyone that he had been in St. Charles at the time of the abduction. He suggested that if Hedrick was forced to say anything, he should claim that they had been there at 10 p.m. instead of 11 p.m. On February 20th, Ferguson returned to Brenda Rosener's house to ask about the rings. Rosener was not home, so Ferguson spoke with her housemate, Ed Metcalf. Ferguson asked Metcalf whether he knew if Rosener wanted to buy the rings. He then told Metcalf that he was being investigated in connection with Kelly Hall's disappearance. Metcalf asked him to leave. That night, Metcalf asked Rosener to show him the rings Ferguson had left behind. Both of them suspected that the rings belonged to Kelly Hall. They decided to contact a relative who was a police officer with the St. and Police Department. The officer took the rings to the St. Charles Police Department, where Kelly Hall's mother identified them as her daughter's property. Early in the morning on February 22nd, a farmer named Warren Stem was working on his farm in the Missouri River bottoms. While walking near a machinery shed, he discovered Kelly Hall's body. Her body was frozen, and she was wearing only socks. Steel building partitions had been placed against the shed to partially hide her body. The partitions were heavy and could not have been moved by one person alone. A forensic pathologist later determined that Kelly had been raped and then strangled to death using a broad ligature, such as a strip of cloth. The examination showed that it would have taken approximately 1 to 2 minutes for her to lose consciousness, followed by another 2 to 3 minutes for her death to occur. There were multiple red horizontal abrasions on her neck, indicating that she had struggled during the strangulation. The process may have taken even longer than several minutes. On the same day that Kelly Hall's body was found, February 22nd, 1989, police and FBI investigators took action. They arranged for Melvin Hedrick to wear a hidden body transmitter and meet with Ferguson at a bar. During their conversation, Hedrick asked Ferguson what had happened to the gun he had with him on the night of the abduction. Ferguson replied, "Just forget the gun. It's gone. I got rid of it." When Hedrick told Ferguson that he suspected him of being involved in the crime, Ferguson said he could understand why Hedrick felt that way. However, Ferguson insisted that Hedrick was wrong about the time they had left the bar. Hedrick pointed out that he had paid with a credit card at Brothers Bar, meaning the exact time would be recorded. Ferguson responded, "Well, then you will just have to go with that." During the conversation, Ferguson also commented on the media attention surrounding the case. He referred to the victim using a vulgar term and said, "They're making a big thing out of this thing, and it's just another fucking cunt who lost it." Ferguson was arrested later that night. After his arrest, police advised Ferguson of his rights. He said he understood those rights and agreed to speak with Detective Michael Harvey. During the interview, Ferguson admitted that he had been at the Shell station across from the mobile station on the night of the abduction. However, he denied any involvement in the crime. The detective showed Ferguson the 3 rings that had belonged to Kelly Hall. The detective told him that the rings had come from an informant named Eddie, who claimed that Ferguson had sold them to him. Ferguson knew that the person being described was Ed Metcalf, but he said Metcalf was lying. The FBI crime laboratory then conducted numerous tests on the evidence collected during the investigation. Investigators tested blood samples from Kelly Hall, Ferguson, and Kenneth Owsley. The results showed that Ferguson had blood type A and was a secretor, meaning his blood type could be identified from his semen. Owsley had blood type B and was a non-secretor. Testing of the vaginal swab and vaginal wash collected from Kelly Hall during the autopsy identified semen from a person with type A blood who was a secretor. Semen found on the collar and inside of Hall's coat also came from a person with type A blood who was a secretor. The laboratory then performed DNA analysis. Scientists compared DNA from the semen stain on the collar of Hall's coat with DNA samples from Ferguson, Owsley, and Hall. Owsley's DNA was not present in the semen stain. However, Ferguson's DNA was a match. Lab workers also examined fibers recovered from Hall's sweater and socks. They compared those fibers with fibers from the carpeting inside Ferguson's blazer, and the fibers were found to be indistinguishable. Investigators also discovered a blonde Caucasian hair on Owsley's shoe that matched Hall's hair. In addition, they found a pubic hair of African American origin on Hall's socks that was indistinguishable from Owsley's sample. Ferguson was charged with first-degree murder, and Kenneth Owsley was also charged. However, in 1993, Owsley pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He received a life sentence and became eligible for parole. He never testified during Ferguson's trial and continued to deny that he was involved in the actual murder, claiming that he only helped dispose of the body. However, the evidence placed him at the scene, and he had been found in possession of Hall's rings. Ferguson's first trial took place in 1992. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. However, the Missouri Supreme Court overturned the conviction in 1994. The court found that the jury instruction used during the trial was incorrect. The instruction allowed the jury to find deliberation for either Ferguson or Owsley. The court explained that for a defendant to be convicted of first-degree murder as an accomplice, the jury had to find that the defendant himself had deliberated. Because the instruction did not require that finding, the conviction was overturned, and Ferguson was granted a new trial. The second trial began in October 1995. This time, Ferguson chose to testify. He told the jury that he had been drinking heavily on the night of the crime. He claimed that he had fallen asleep in the back seat of his Chevrolet Blazer and said he did not remember anything about what happened. He denied killing Hall. However, the prosecution presented the physical evidence again, including the DNA match, the fiber evidence, the rings, and Ferguson's own efforts to get rid of evidence connected to the crime. The witness who had seen Kelly get into the Blazer also testified. The jury once again found Ferguson guilty and again recommended the death penalty. On December 8, 1995, the trial court followed the jury's recommendation and sentenced Ferguson to death. Over the following years, Ferguson's attorneys filed numerous appeals. In 2000, the Missouri Supreme Court reviewed the case again and upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. In 2005, The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his federal habeas corpus petition. His lawyers challenged several issues, including the DNA evidence, the hearsay statements from Owsley, and later, the state's refusal to reveal where it obtained its execution drugs. Supporters argued that Ferguson had changed while in prison. They said he had become religious, counseled other inmates, and helped start a prison hospice program. They argued that he was no longer the same person who had committed the crime. However, the courts did not agree. In March 2014, an execution date was scheduled for March 26. Ferguson's lawyers filed last-minute appeals with the U.S. Supreme Court and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, asking them to stop the execution. Both courts denied the requests. The governor also denied Ferguson's clemency petition, stating that the jury's decision was appropriate. On March 25, 2014, the day before the execution, the governor released a statement saying that Kelly Hall had been brutally taken from her family and that the sentence would be carried out. On March 26, 2014, shortly after midnight, Ferguson was taken to the death chamber at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. His final meal consisted of barbecue ribs, French fries, and apple pie. He was strapped to a gurney and covered with a white sheet. His 2 daughters and other family members were present in the witness room. During those final moments, Ferguson made funny faces at his family and mouthed that he loved them. He also gave a final statement. He said he was sorry for being the reason they had all been brought into the dark business of execution. He prayed that the victim's family would find peace in their hearts and lose the anger and hate that had driven them. At 12:01 a.m., the lethal drug pentobarbital was administered. Ferguson took a few deep breaths, moved his feet, and then closed his eyes. He was pronounced dead at 12:11 a.m. at the age of 59. Kelly Hall's father, Jim Hall, witnessed the execution along with his son and ex-wife. Afterward, he spoke with the press. He said it had been a very long 25 years waiting for the execution to take place. He said the crime had torn 2 families apart. He expressed relief that it was finally over and said, "Kelly can rest now." Ferguson's body was taken for burial according to the arrangements he had made with his family. Kenneth Owsley remained in prison, serving his life sentence, and the Hall family continued attending his parole hearings to argue that he should never be released. The execution of Jeffrey Ferguson closed the legal case against him. However, for the family of Kelly Hall, the loss of their 17-year-old daughter was a wound that would never fully heal. Story 5. Anthony Dwayne Doyle was born on October 16, 1984, in Dallas, Texas. He grew up in the Dallas area and lived with his parents in a house located in Rowlett, a suburb just east of Dallas. His family was not wealthy, and as he got older, Doyle felt pressure from both his parents and his girlfriend to earn money. He had a daughter who was born just 3 weeks before the events that would later change his life. However, throughout most of his childhood and teenage years, Doyle's life was marked by ongoing behavioral problems that had started when he was very young. From the time Doyle was in elementary school, he showed serious problems with his behavior. His principal during the 4th and 5th grades had to deal with him almost every day, constantly handling disciplinary issues involving Doyle. There was no evidence that Doyle had any psychological problems, no evidence that he was hyperactive, and no evidence that problems at home were causing his behavior. Despite this, his actions continued to be highly disruptive and difficult for teachers and school staff to manage. When Doyle was in the 5th grade, his behavior on the school bus became especially severe. He acted out so often and so aggressively that the bus driver became afraid. The driver was concerned not only for his own safety, but also for the safety of the other children riding the bus. Because of this, the school decided that Doyle would no longer be allowed to ride the bus. This was the school's original and firm decision. However, Doyle's mother asked the school to allow him to continue riding. The school agreed to her request, but only under a strict condition. Doyle could continue riding the bus only if he was physically restrained in his seat. This meant he had to be strapped down or otherwise held in place so that he could not create further problems. When Doyle moved into the 6th grade, his behavior did not improve. He continued to get into trouble regularly. He was disciplined for bullying other students, fighting with other students, pushing other students, and hitting other students. He also talked back to teachers and threatened them. In one specific incident, Doyle stabbed a fellow student in the back several times with a pencil. He did this for no apparent reason, and the attack was sudden and unprovoked. At one point after the 6th grade, Doyle created a situation of racial conflict at his school. He divided the African American and Hispanic students against the Anglo students. The conflict became serious enough that school staff had to intervene. They provided group counseling and other forms of intervention in an attempt to calm the situation. Doyle continued to have many other disciplinary problems as well. He slapped and punched other students, harassed other students, stole things, pushed people down, defaced school property, and skipped detentions. When he was confronted about his behavior, Doyle regularly blamed others, minimized his own involvement, and refused to accept responsibility for his actions. He also had a quick temper that could flare up without warning. In 1997, when Doyle was about 13 years old, he was adjudicated in juvenile court. This meant that a judge officially found that he had committed offenses. The offenses were assault, theft, and criminal mischief. As a result, Doyle was placed on probation. He was allowed to remain in the custody of his parents, but he was required to follow rules established by the court. In 1998, he was adjudicated again, this time for the offense of evading arrest. This meant that he had run away from police officers who were attempting to catch him. During this same period, Doyle also harassed a faculty member from his school. He repeatedly called the teachers home late at night, and whenever someone answered the phone, he would curse at them. The teacher had the calls traced and pressed charges against Doyle. Because of this, Doyle was placed on juvenile probation again. As a result of this new probation, he was removed from his parents' custody and placed in the Dallas County Youth Village, a facility for young people who had committed offenses. In February of 1999, Doyle entered a boot camp program. Boot camp was a strict, military-style program designed to discipline young offenders. He was discharged from the program in March of the same year because of repeated violent outbursts directed at staff members and other students. The staff at the Dallas County Youth Village made special efforts to help Doyle and worked hard to provide support and guidance. However, despite these efforts, he was unsuccessfully terminated from the program because of his continued behavior problems. He kept fighting, kept bullying others, disrespected staff members, and argued with everyone around him. At one point, Doyle threatened a teacher who confronted him for failing to complete his homework. As an adult, Doyle continued to have problems with the law. In 2002, the year before the murder, he was arrested for stealing a paint sprayer. The paint sprayer was valued between $500 and $1,500. He pleaded no contest to the charge, was fined $500, and received deferred adjudication with 18 months of probation. This meant that if he stayed out of trouble for 18 months, the charge would not become part of his permanent record. In another incident that same year, Doyle fled from a gas station after failing to pay for gas. While he was escaping, he broadsided another vehicle in the street. He abandoned his own car and ran away on foot. Police officers chased him and eventually caught him. He was charged with evading arrest. Doyle pleaded no contest to the charge of failure to stop after a traffic accident. He was fined $500 and sentenced to 30 days in the Dallas County Jail. He was also sent to a halfway house for violating his probation. A halfway house is a place where people live under supervision after being released from jail. Doyle was released from the halfway house before the end of the year. By the time of the events that would follow, Doyle had connections with a gang known for numerous acts of violence. He was also under pressure from his parents and his girlfriend to earn money. He had a 3-week-old daughter, and people around him expected him to provide financial support. However, he could not find a job. He was 18 years old, had only completed the 10th grade, and had a long history of behavioral problems and encounters with the law. His temper was quick, he had been violent many times before, and he had shown a pattern of blaming others for his own actions. These factors from Doyle's early life and teenage years set the stage for what would happen next. On January 16, 2003, Anthony Doyle was at his parents' home in Rowlett, Texas. He was 18 years old and had a 3-week-old daughter. He felt pressure to get money, but he was unable to find a job. Because of this, he decided to get money through robbery. He chose a nearby donut shop called Chaha Donut as his target. Doyle knew that the shop delivered food to customers' homes, and he planned to use that delivery service to bring a victim directly to him. From his parents' home telephone, Doyle called the Chaha Donut shop and placed an order for 24 donuts and 24 breakfast tacos. He requested that the order be delivered to his parents' home. During the call, he disguised his voice so the person taking the order would not recognize him. He also gave a false name, telling the employee that his name was Mary. This was an attempt to hide his identity and prevent the shop from connecting the delivery back to him later. The shop prepared the order. The employee who took the call was a 37-year-old woman named Hyunmi Cho. She was originally from South Korea and had been living in the United States for about 2 years. Cho worked at the donut shop to earn money that she could send back to her parents, who were ill and living in South Korea. She was a hard-working employee who carefully performed her duties. After taking the order, she placed the donuts and tacos in her car and drove to the address Doyle had provided, which was his parents' home. When Cho arrived at the house, she carried the food to the door. Doyle met her there, but he did not immediately take the order. Instead, he demanded money from her and told her to give him cash. Cho explained that she did not have any money with her. She was a delivery worker, and she did not carry large amounts of cash while making deliveries. When she told him she had no money, Doyle became angry. He picked up a baseball bat that he had prepared nearby and attacked her. Doyle swung the bat and struck Cho in the head with great force. He hit her multiple times. Later evidence would show that Cho had been struck at least 7 times in the head. She also suffered many other bruises on her hands, arms, and body from trying to defend herself during the attack. Cho fell to the ground, badly injured and unable to get up. Doyle knew he had done something very serious. However, he did not call for help, and he did not attempt to save her. Instead, he decided to hide her body and clean up the crime scene. He went to a neighbor's house across the alley and found a large plastic trash bin. He brought the bin back to his parents' home and placed Cho's body inside it. He turned the bin on its side, pushed her into it, and then turned the bin upright again. At some point while moving her body, Doyle looked inside the bin and saw that Cho appeared to still be breathing. He also saw her move her arms, as if she was trying to get up. She was still alive at that moment. However, Doyle did not help her. He left her inside the bin. Doyle then began trying to remove evidence from inside the house. There was a large amount of blood on the floor and walls. He gathered cleaning supplies and used bleach in an attempt to remove the bloodstains from the floor. He also used barbecue sauce, pouring it over a large bloody area on the carpet because he planned to make it appear as though the stain was caused by food. He repainted one of the walls to cover blood spatter that was visible on it. Doyle scrubbed and painted, trying to hide what had happened, but he was unable to clean everything. After cleaning as much as he could, Doyle took Cho's belongings. He stole her car, her cell phone, and her credit cards. He left the trash bin containing Cho's body across the alley at the neighbor's house. He then got into Cho's car and drove away. Doyle drove to meet some friends and brought the donuts and breakfast tacos with him. He shared the food with them. When his friends asked where he got the car, he told them he had obtained it by hitting a lick. This was street slang meaning that he had made money quickly, usually through a robbery. He also told them that he was not playing anymore. This statement meant that he had done something more serious than a simple theft. His friends understood that he had committed a violent crime. Later, Doyle and his friends attempted to use Cho's credit cards to purchase items. They tried making purchases at several stores, although it was unclear whether any of those attempts were successful. Back at the donut shop, Cho's co-workers and employer noticed that she had not returned from the delivery. She had been gone for an unusually long time, and this caused concern. They called the police and reported that Cho was missing. Officers began searching for her and started focusing their investigation on the area where the delivery address was located. On that same day, a woman who lived near Doyle's parents' home went to retrieve something from her trash bin. She lived across the alley from the house. When she opened the bin, she discovered Cho's body inside. Horrified by what she found, she immediately called the police. At that time, officers were already searching for Cho because of the missing person report. When they received the call about a body being found in a trash bin, they responded quickly. They began canvassing the neighborhood, going door to door and asking residents whether they had seen anything unusual. When officers arrived at Doyle's parents' home, they knocked on the door. Doyle was not there at the time. His sister answered and allowed the officers inside. She told them that she had just arrived home and noticed something strange. She pointed out a wet brown spot on the carpet and also told them that she smelled a strong odor of bleach and fresh paint. These unusual smells made the officers suspicious. As they searched the home, they found blood spatters on the floor and walls. They also saw marks from the wheels of a trash bin on the floor. Inside the house, they found blood-stained clothing belonging to Doyle, along with cleaning supplies, including bleach and paint. Meanwhile, Doyle had taken Cho's car to a car wash and left it there. He had also thrown her possessions into a nearby dumpster. Police later searched that dumpster and recovered Cho's belongings. They also found the original receipt from the donut delivery. The receipt showed the order placed with Chaha Donut and confirmed that the delivery had been made to Doyle's address. Police now had strong evidence connecting Doyle to the crime. After learning that police had found Cho's body, Doyle realized he was in serious trouble. He decided to run away. He fled the area and went into hiding. His mother attempted to contact him and tried to convince him to come to the police station and speak with officers. At first, Doyle agreed to do what his mother asked. He said he would go to the station. However, he never showed up. He stayed away. Police continued searching for him. They believed he was the person who had placed the order, attacked Cho with the bat, placed her in the trash bin, and stolen her car and credit cards. They had collected evidence from the house, the dumpster, and the surrounding neighborhood, but they had not yet captured him. Doyle remained at large, knowing that police were searching for him. The police continued their search for Anthony Doyle after gathering evidence from his parents' home and from the dumpster where he had thrown Cho's belongings. Investigators knew that Doyle was the person who had placed the delivery order and the person who had committed the murder. On January 17, 2003, the day after the murder, police located Doyle at a friend's home in Dallas. They arrested him there without incident. He was taken into custody and brought to the police station for questioning. Once Doyle was at the police station, officers began interviewing him. During the interview, Doyle gave an oral confession. He admitted that he had called the donut shop, that he had demanded money from Cho, and that he had struck her with the baseball bat. After he gave this oral confession, officers asked him to write down what had happened. Doyle agreed. He He spent more than 2 hours writing a 10-page confession. In it, he explained in detail what he had done. He also told officers where he had hidden the murder weapon and his blood-stained clothing. Doyle then led investigators to those locations so they could recover the items as evidence. On April 2, 2003, Doyle was formally indicted by a grand jury in Criminal District Court No. 3 of Dallas County, Texas. He was charged with capital murder. The indictment stated that Doyle had murdered Hyun-Mi Cho while he was in the course of committing and attempting to commit robbery. Because of the specific circumstances of the charge, the case was eligible for the death penalty under Texas law. Doyle's trial began in May of 2004. He entered a plea of not guilty. Like other Texas capital cases, the trial was divided into 2 phases. The first phase was the guilt-innocence phase. During this stage, prosecutors presented the evidence they had collected. They showed the jury the blood-stained clothing, the blood spatters on the walls and floor, the tracks left by the trash bin, the receipt from the donut delivery, the stolen credit cards, and Doyle's written confession. They also presented witness testimony, including testimony from the friend Doyle stayed with after the murder. The defense argued that Doyle's original intention was only to rob Cho, and that he had not planned to kill her. They attempted to show that the murder was not intentional. However, the evidence presented against Doyle was very strong. On May 5, 2004, after hearing all of the evidence and deliberating, the jury found Doyle guilty of capital murder. The case then moved into the second phase, known as the punishment phase. During this phase, the jury had to decide whether Doyle would receive the death penalty or a sentence of life in prison. The prosecution presented evidence about Doyle's previous criminal history and his pattern of violent behavior. They showed the jury his long record of aggressive actions, including his disciplinary problems at school, his juvenile court adjudications, and his adult arrests. The defense presented witnesses who testified about Doyle's character and his difficult upbringing. They also presented testimony from a defense expert who stated that Doyle was not mentally retarded, that he had a normal IQ, and that he understood the difference between right and wrong. The jury was asked to answer special questions about whether Doyle would pose a future danger to society, and whether there were enough mitigating factors to justify a life sentence instead of the death penalty. After reviewing all of the evidence, the jury answered the special questions in a way that required the death penalty. On May 10, 2004, the trial judge formally sentenced Anthony Doyle to death. He was transferred to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where he remained on death row while awaiting execution. Doyle continued fighting his sentence through the appeals process. He filed a direct appeal with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the highest court in Texas for criminal cases. In his appeal, he raised arguments concerning problems with jury selection and challenged the constitutionality of the death penalty. On May 10, 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction and sentence. Doyle then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. On October 16, 2006, the Supreme Court denied his petition for a writ of certiorari, meaning that the court refused to hear his case. Doyle also filed a state application for a writ of habeas corpus, a legal action that allows a prisoner to challenge the legality of his detention. He filed this application on November 7, 2005. The trial court reviewed his claims and issued findings recommending that he be denied relief. On January 23, 2008, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals adopted those findings and denied his habeas petition. After completing his state appeals, Doyle filed a federal habeas corpus petition in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas. He filed the petition on January 14, 2009. In this petition, he raised several claims. One claim argued that his attorneys had provided ineffective assistance because they failed to properly challenge the voluntariness of his confession. Another claim argued that his sentence violated the Eighth Amendment because he was still developmentally a juvenile, even though he was older than 18 years old. On June 25, 2012, the federal district court denied Doyle's petition. Doyle then asked the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit for permission to appeal the decision. On July 10, 2013, the Fifth Circuit denied his request. The court found that his claims lacked merit. The court specifically stated that his argument that his confession had been coerced by state actors from his past was an unreasonable interpretation of the law. Doyle made one final attempt to stop his execution. On December 5, 2013, he filed a petition for a writ of certiorari with the United States Supreme Court. On February 24, 2014, the Supreme Court denied the petition. At that point, all of Doyle's appeals had been exhausted. His execution date was set for March 27, 2014. On the day of the execution, Doyle's attorneys filed a final appeal with the Supreme Court. They argued that jurors in his trial had received false evidence regarding his inability to be rehabilitated while he was in juvenile detention. About 2 hours before the scheduled execution, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal and allowed the execution to move forward. On March 27, 2014, at approximately 6:25 p.m., Anthony Doyle was taken into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was strapped to the gurney. The warden asked him if he wanted to make a final statement. Doyle shook his head from left to right, indicating that he did not. He said nothing. The execution team then began administering the lethal injection, which used a sedative called pentobarbital. Doyle kept his eyes closed throughout the procedure. He took several breaths and then began to quietly snore. Shortly afterward, he stopped moving. At 6:49 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 29 years old. After the execution, the case reached its conclusion. Hyunmi Cho's family did not attend the execution. Cho was a native of South Korea who had come to the United States to earn money to support her ill parents. She had been working hard at the donut shop when she was killed. Doyle's execution could not bring Cho back, but it completed the legal process that had started with her murder more than 11 years earlier. Anthony Doyle became the 1,373rd murderer executed in the United States since 1976, and the 512th murderer executed in Texas since that year. The story of how one young man's violent temper and desperate need for money led to a brutal murder, followed by a lengthy legal battle and finally an execution, had reached its final and irreversible conclusion.